Can you all hear me? Cool. All right. I'm just waiting for folks to join. I'm going to start in about a minute or two, probably. I've set this up that I have to admit people, which is a mistake because it's going to distract me a little bit, but I'll stick with it here for a few minutes. I hope you notice I'm recording the meeting so if you know folks who can't make the meeting, I'm going to find a way to post this either on my website or on the HiTOP website. Well, we're well attended here. Let's see. All right. I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully y'all can see the presentation that I'm putting up. Do you guys see my notes or do you see my slides?
Presenter view.
Oh man, let's see. Hold on. Isn't there a way to switch that up here?
Yes, if you close out of Zoom. I'm
Yeah.
not close out of Zoom. Stop sharing your screen.
Yeah.
Now go to PowerPoint and start presenter view.
Oh, I see. Hold on. I see swapping here. Okay. And I'll share my screen again. Let's see what happens. All right, we'll figure this out. All right, do you guys see my slides now? Yay.
That looks
Okay, we
good.
figured this out. Our first challenge. The other thing I need to figure out is how to get people to admit people into the room.
Len, if you want to make me a co-host, I can admit folks.
Oh, that would be awesome. Wow, so helpful. Got to find you. Stephanie. There you are, Stephanie. All right, Stephanie, you are now co-host, I think. Thank you. All right, thanks everybody for joining me today. This has been something that the work group has been doing for a long time now. And so I'm happy to finally present the results to not only the measurement work group, but also to the consortium at large who have an interest in measuring these constructs. So the agenda for today, we're going to try to do three things. And I don't have a good sense for how long it'll take. In my mind, I feel like we can get through the presentation part in about 45 minutes and then leave some time for discussion. I want this to be interactive as much as possible. So we're going to retrace our steps a little bit. What steps have we taken as a measurement work group to get to the point of having a HiTOP self-report measure? I'm going to introduce the HiTOP-SR to everyone on the call. And then we're going to talk about next steps for the measure and the work group. Because I think that there are some important things that we need to think about in terms of reimagining the way the work group functions, in terms of continuing to promote the measurement of the HiTOP constructs, and helping to disseminate those into research and clinical settings. So this is where we're going. So some of you have seen me talking over the last year. I've presented subsets of this talk at some conferences and things like that. So I apologize to those of you who've seen me talk about some of this stuff previously. I promise there's something new here for everybody, I promise, but there will be some retracing of steps for those who've seen these things, because not everybody on the call has seen all of this before. So let's back up way back to 2017 when I was first got involved with putting together the measurement work group. We recognized early on in the process that the development of measures would be really important and would determine the ultimate impact of the model. I mean, obviously the model has proliferated. There's lots of studies looking at HiTOP relevant sorts of issues nowadays, but we knew that to really move things forward, we want a measure that was specifically keyed to the model itself as much as possible. And I think the risk is that if we didn't have adequate measurement, that this could be seen as a intellectually interesting exercise, but perhaps practically useless in some way. In research settings, obviously, HiTOP specific measures are needed to study all the elements of the model, including the placement of new or provisional elements, or as well as for theories of etiology and intervention. We need to standardize targets for those sorts of studies and interventions. In the clinic, obviously, HiTOP specific measures are needed to offer practicing clinicians a viable alternative to the traditional classification methods that HiTOP was meant to, in a perfect world, replace. So how do we go about assessing HiTOP? The consortium has worked along two independent routes. Those of you who've been around for a while know all this already. The clinical translation work group identified a number of years ago a set of what they called HiTOP consistent measures that could be used immediately, and they put those together into something called the HiTOP DAT. And you can, and there's Qualtrics and REDCap versions of that researchers can use. And there are some clinics that were using those HiTOP consistent measures. And it's things like the CAT-PD and the IDAS and related measures. But the measures development work group has been working a different way, which is to developing HiTOP specific measures that are tied to the elements of the HiTOP structure and that provide presumably a means of directly testing that structure. The second part will be trickier to do than I probably originally imagined, but I'll get to more about that later on in the presentation. Certainly external measures exist for pretty much everything within HiTOP, but so the primary goal was for a unified set of measures that spans the full breadth. Not an easy task. So we wanted to build a HiTOP measure, but we needed a framework to guide our collective work on this. And we looked to the construct validation sorts of methods that were promoted by Jane Levenger. So Levenger 57 was really the first to systematically describe a theory-driven way method for test construction, firmly grounded in the idea of construct validity. We based our scale development procedures on Levenger's principles of construct validity, especially as articulated by people like Clark and Watson, who've written important papers on this topic. The measurement development is proceeding through three phases. I'm summarizing, I should back up and just say for a moment, I'm summarizing a tremendous amount of work in relatively few slides here. And so just be aware of that. And everything that's in that blue phase one bubble is encompassed in some papers that have already been published. And I'll show you the table of contents for those. The most of the new things we've been doing since those papers is in the orange square, which is phase two. But phase one really corresponds to Levenger's what we call what she called the substantive validity phase of scale development, looking at developing construct lists and developing conceptual definitions for the constructs, building the item pools for these candidate constructs, collecting responses to those, and developing some sense of preliminary scales. Okay, essentially starting to do that from the ground up within at the level of understanding the constructs we're trying to measure and developing conceptual definitions and so forth, building the item pool. Phase two was about cross-validation, finalizing the scales, and then starting to look at things like structural validity. And phase three, which is I think where we're transitioning after this meeting, frankly, is looking at external validation and then doing things to help with clinical utility, like norms and translations. And I'll say a lot more about clinical utility, things that need to happen later on in this presentation. So the measures development work group has included many members who've contributed in a wide variety of ways. A wide variety of ways people have contributed to this process since 2017, 2018. Folks have been, I'll show you the names of these folks in a moment, suggesting and defining candidate constructs within the HiTOP domains, building item pools, collecting data. Some folks have helped pay for data collection. Some folks in the work group have been helping us analyze data along the way, reviewing and providing feedback on the measure at various points along the way, and then helping with other measurement related goals like interview development or building an informant report or translations into other languages, some of which are already underway. I'll say more about all that later, but the big point I'm trying to make here is that this has been a distributed labor model. Lots of people have been involved in this process from the start, and it's only been growing over time. In phase one, which is again that substantive validity phase, these are the individuals who helped, and they were organized. I'll say more about this in a moment, but they were organized into 5 content-based subgroups who built those constructs and those item pools from the ground up. Who built those constructs and the item pools from the ground up, and then analyzed those data to build preliminary scales. In phase 2, which we're finishing up now, I had a smaller group of individuals helping us do the analyses, the statistical analyses that needed to be done to get these across the finish line. Okay. So what I want to do is give a brief summary of the phase one methods and results for those of you who haven't been along for the ride the whole time. But note that all these phase one methods and results are already published. They're in a special issue of Assessment that came out last year, and I'll show you the table of contents of that in a moment. But I'll present a little bit here. This is one version, a more colorful version of the HiTOP model that everybody on this call is familiar with. I don't need to run through it. The most important thing is to talk about how we thought about this model in terms of our methods and scale development. So obviously, this is the full model. I'm breaking it down to 2 different elements right here. Our measurement subgroups are really organized top down by the spectra and the subfactors. Now, originally there was a single or 2 externalizing groups, one for disinhibited and one antagonistic. Eventually, those combined, and we had a single externalizing that kind of divided and conquered that domain internally. So that left us with 5 spectra-based subfactors, spectra-based subgroups, I should say. But then measure development proceeded bottom up at the level of symptom components and maladaptive traits relevant to each of those subfactors and spectra. The early papers on the HiTOP model listed some candidate symptom components and maladaptive traits, but those weren't as evidence-based, or there wasn't as much consensus around those as there was around the spectra and the subfactors. So we really decided to start from scratch, if you will, from the bottom up. And you can even see in the model, symptom components and maladaptive traits is just this line. It's not very well articulated in this particular version of the model. So we proceeded bottom up, kind of with an exhaustive search of possible components. So again, we organized in phase 1, we organized the members into 5 psychopathology spectrum-based subgroups that you see there. They identified an exhaustive set of candidate constructs, defined them, and built item pools relevant to their domains. And each group collected their own data, but followed a centralized data analytic plan to develop candidate scales that they would push into the phase 2 portion of the study. Okay. This slide summarizes probably 2 years worth of work. So just so you have a sense for the scope of what's been going on over the last 5-6 years. We also did some other things in phase 1 that have had that are important, and I thought this was a good place to talk about it. Other decisions that we made early on in the process that help guide our decisions about how to write items and what kinds of constructs to include. One thing we decided early on was to opt for a 4-point degree-based response format. Not a lot, not at all, a little, moderately, and a lot. Okay. The reason this is important, and all these seemingly trivial things are important on this slide, is that they have important implications for how you write the items. And so that's why I'm talking about them here. We opted for a past year time frame. We spent a lot of time debating this. Now, so the items are written in the past tense, referring to the past year, but they're written in such a way that we can make new versions in the future that would have different time frames if we wanted to. Anything in the past tense. The only thing that we have to change is if we had a currently sort of time frame, we'd have to come up with a way to rephrase the item for present tense. But because they're written in the past tense, you could say past year, you could say lifetime, you could say past 6 months, you could say past 2 weeks, but the items were written with a past year time frame in mind. We opted to write items to reflect a broad range of psychopathology content, including various signs, symptoms, features, and traits. There was a lot of debate about, should this just be signs and symptoms? What about traits? What's the difference between a sign and a symptom and a trait? So we just decided to remain agnostic with respect to those sorts of just differentiations and write items that we felt reflected the constructs that we were defining. These are the instructions that we agreed upon. In this survey, you'll be asked to respond to a number of statements about your thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Some of these things are pretty common, whereas others are less common. As you complete the survey, please consider whether there have been significant times during the last 12 months during which the following statements applied to you. Then please select the option that best describes how well each statement described you during that period. This is the set of instructions that we've used for all the data collections on these items to date. I should also mention, I think I said it before a lot of people joined the call, but I'm going to leave time for discussion at the end. I'm not good enough with Zoom and with the different screens I have going on to monitor my chat very well. So if people are chatting about this, I won't notice it till the end probably. But if you do have questions, I do want to leave time at the end for discussion either on the chat board and hopefully some live Q&A. This is the special issue of assessment that Doug Samuel published in his assessment journal. There's a lead paper that talks about the kind of all the conceptual decisions that were made in phase 1. And then there's a separate paper for each of the sub-factors. And there's even some response papers by Edelyn Verona and Shannon Sowers-Zavala, who provide some good critique of what we were doing. So things to think about for future directions. Okay. So let me talk about the summary of what phase 1 came up with. In phase 1, all that effort that the subgroups put in resulted in 181 candidate constructs and measured by almost 2,200 items. Okay, so obviously that's too many. It's not only too many constructs, but it's too many items because you can't have a measure that measures that many things. Even if you needed 181 constructs, I'm not convinced you would want to really have any measure that would try to measure all of them at the same time. It was never meant to be the final idea. That was just all conceptual. So the subgroups then did data collections within their subgroups. They identified various, and every group did this in different ways, but they identified a range of students and communities, sometimes patient samples. And they did data collection structural analyses within their subgroups according to a centralized data analytic plan that Aidan Wright and I developed. And that resulted in a smaller group of constructs and items that we took into phase 2 data collection. 142 constructs and encompassing almost 1,200 items, which is still probably too many items or too many constructs and definitely too many items. But we knew we were erring on the side of inclusiveness at this stage of the game. We didn't want to cut things out prematurely before we went through separate data collections to cross-validate. So we took all of that information into phase 2, which again, the goals of which were cross-validation and scale finalization. Now, I think this idea of cross-validation was a bit of a kind of pie in the sky sort of goal, because it turns out we had to make a lot more decisions. It wasn't purely cross-validation. We were still honing things and reducing the number of constructs and definitely reducing the number of items to what you're going to see in a few minutes. And so cross-validation, yeah, but more about continued analyses, continued honing of the scales to get them down to a final form. And that took more work than than I even anticipated, because we had some additional data collections we did. So anyway, the phase 2 data collection took place across a number of patient, community, crowdsourced, and student samples. Given the large numbers of phase 2 constructs and items, there was various amounts of planned missingness across the samples. We had some samples where there was relatively little missingness because they were able to give the full item pool across multiple time periods. But in most of the samples, we did a planned missingness sort of approach to the data, where random subsets of the items are given to participants. So what we had to do for analyses is the item level analyses to construct the scales were conducted using pairwise present strategy on matrices of polychoric correlations. And I won't get into the rationale for polychorics if you're not familiar with that kind of a correlation, but it's a correlation that is better suited for these sorts of ordinal kinds of items, especially when there's a heavy amount of skew involved in some of them. So we based the analyses on polychorics. The total clean sample size, again, we included some validity indicators so we could chop out some noise, but the clean sample size for items that were not substance use disorder related was just over 4,000 individuals. We ran a separate set of data collections for substance use disorder items, where that sample size is nearly 1,500 individuals. I'm not going to talk as much about the substance use disorder scales today. I'll say more about that in a moment, but I thought I'd give you the full account of what we've been up to. So the phase 2 samples, again, the total clean N, about 4,100. There were patients from, these are patients that we actually recruited from the community in Buffalo and Stony Brook and University of North Texas. We did some work on Prolific, which is a crowdsourced website where we could look for what we were kind of calling internally like analog patients, folks who report currently or recently being in treatment based on the screening items that Prolific provides. We had some student samples. There was one MTurk sample that David Priest was able to provide to us. And then there was another Prolific sample involved at this stage, which was more of a community representative Prolific crowdsourced sample. For those of you not familiar with Prolific, it's like, let's just say it's crowdsourced like MTurk, but with a higher degree of confidence that you're getting signal versus noise. And there's a lot of built-in things in the Prolific system that allow you to verify that the people who are completing your study, A, are real people, and B, they do their job well when they're doing these kinds of studies. So there's a high degree of, I have more confidence in Prolific data than I do in, say, MTurk data usually. Here for the phase 2 samples pulled together, reasonable diversity, a little more female, reasonable diversity in terms of race and ethnicity. And even though these were, and again, because some of these samples were patient samples, 60% report a history of psychiatric treatment, and about a third of the sample collectively reported currently being in psychiatric treatment for some reason. Similarly, we had smaller sample size for substance use, the substance use scales at this stage of the game. But most of it was from patients that we collected locally in Buffalo, Stony Brook, and North Texas. And then we were able to do some work with Prolific as well to add another roughly 550 individuals to that. Okay. Similar amounts of diversity in that sample. All right. So what was our analytic strategy in phase 2? Again, I'm summarizing a ton of work and a ton of words, frankly, in a relatively simple slide, but let me see if I can do this here. So preliminary scales came from phase 1, okay? Scales 1 through K here. Once we had the data, but there's too many scales. There were 142 scales and you can't just throw there's 1,200 items in there. You can't throw 1,200 items into the factor analysis and say, give me a clean set of scales. It just doesn't work that neatly. Our techniques aren't so good as that. And so what we did is that we scored those preliminary scales and then factor analyzed those scale scores to reduce the number of scales that we were analyzing or co-analyzing down to manageable numbers of items. Okay. That led to what we scale groupings A through whatever. There were actually 9 scale groupings in the middle here in the orange part. Okay, scale A, B, C, whatever the 9th letter of the alphabet is. There are 9 groupings of scales, and then we did factor analyses of the items within those scale groupings. So what this, just if you're following along, what this strategy allowed us to do is identify scales that are very similar to each other with very similar item content, and we're co-analyzing those items together. And that allows us to reduce the item pool and really identify areas of redundancy in our item pool where there was plenty, and areas where we could really consolidate beyond what we had at phase 1. So factor analysis of the items within the groups led to what we called candidate scales 1 through K. All right. Got to go to the next slide. Then we needed to trim and finalize those scales. And at this point of the game, we really thought we'd be finalizing them. Okay. And we did this through we had analysts helping us with all these steps. They were looking at content validity, internal consistency, factor structure, IRT information curves, some interstitial issues like between the different scale groupings. We got feedback from the team and we had to iterate as needed. And this led to scales 1 through K. Scales 1 through K. I'm not calling them final scale 1 through K yet, because there was another round of review after these red scales came out, where I sent these scales back out to the analytic teams and the former subgroup chairs to take a look at what we'd done, to see if there's anything that we needed to continue to do to fix the set of scales that, or any obvious issues that need to be resolved before we release these into the wild for people to use. Okay. So that process resulted in feedback from the analytic teams. It resulted in an experimental version of the measure in which we actually ended up adding some new items, which it's tricky to do at this stage of the game, because when you add new items, you need to collect more data. You know, it turned out, and I've chosen for this presentation not to put in all the feedback that we got from the analytic teams, but there was clear there were some things missing. There were some constructs that we weren't measuring as well as we would like the items that we thought we were measuring, that we were using, just weren't working very well. And in some cases, some constructs didn't make the cut, and there was consensus that we needed to try to let them make the cut. You know, like they had gotten jettisoned along the way. And I can answer questions about some of those decisions later during Q&A if there's questions about that. So we collected an additional data set over the last 4 or 5 months, where we administered the full HiTOP-SR EXP, the experimental version, which had about 450, 480 items in it, I think. Plus it had the substance use disorder module. We found that we collected another set of prolific participants who were meant to be community representative in the US. So they were stratified with respect to biological sex and age, and it turns out they're reasonably diverse in terms of ethnicity and race as well, at least in terms of US sorts of numbers. So that's a strength and also a limitation, because it is specific to the US. Again, I'll show you some demographics: relatively even for biological sex, reasonable diversity for ethnicity and race. Age, when we stratified specifically for age, and so we have good representation across the age span. With prolific, you can do this if you do it the right way. So the mean age was 44 and a half, and we had people participating between the ages of 18 and 80, and with a pretty uniform distribution for most of that distribution. We have way more demographic data than this, but I'm just showing you a smattering. Reasonably diverse in terms of education level as well, which you might think of as a proxy for socioeconomic status. We also have income data, which I have not presented. I'm not presenting here, but I have it. And then similar to the previous samples, I just wanted to get a sense, give you all a sense for who these folks are. These are meant to be community representative, but reasonable numbers of these folks have also either currently been in treatment or in the past years had been in treatment, but not currently. Okay, and then some of them had been in treatment previously, but not in the past year. So this tells us that even though it's a community representative, these folks in many cases are exhibiting or have experienced symptoms that are relevant to the things we're trying to measure on the HiTOP-SR. Okay. So finalizing the scales. So I've moved those red scales that I had on the previous slide off to the left now. And I want to explain what we did between the red and the blue. And the blue scales on the right are the final forms of these scales that I'm presenting to you today. And I have to say that at each step along the way, fewer and fewer people have been involved in the analyses. And in this final step from red to blue, and this is either a strength or a limitation, depending on your perspective, I did the most of that work because the work that needed to be done to trim it was better suited for a single person, I thought, to kind of hone things in a way that maintain the overall structure of the measure. And hopefully that'll become clear when I go through some of the things, some of the decisions that were made. So experimental items were added, as I mentioned. We did that prolific data collection. And the final scale honing was based on the same sorts of things that were involved before, looking at content validity, looking at internal consistency estimates, looking at factor structure, IRT information curves, and then dealing with some of the interstitial issues again. And what I mean by that is overlap across scales and across scale groupings that need to be sorted out. So what did that lead us with? What did that leave us with at the end of the day? After all these data collections, here is what the measure includes. There are 405 items in the base measure. I say base measure because that's not including the substance use disorder measure, or what I'm calling, I think HiTOP's developed a different phrase for that now. I think it's harmful substance use is the official phrase. Sometimes I use them interchangeably. We have 405 items in the measure, measuring 76 primary scales. It turns out there's 17 subscales. I'll say more about subscales in a moment. The mean items per scale for the primary scales is 5.3. So these are relatively tight scales. And the reason that they needed to be tight is that we have so many constructs we're trying to measure. One of the things I put in the asterisk here is that if you count the scales and the subscales, it's kind of a little bit of a mind trick. There are 87 unique scales or subscales because subscales are nested within some of the primary scales. And that'll become clear when I show you the scales in a moment. And there's this SUD module with 6 additional scales that'll assess up to 3 substances, which is pending some final analyses. We did another separate prolific data collection just to evaluate some experimental work we were doing on the substance use disorder module. And I just haven't had a chance to finish that. That's another can of worms. So I'll say more about that later. All right. So let's talk about scales versus subscales. I think we naively started the process thinking that we would just build a bunch of facet scales that were all at the same exact level of specificity or generality, you know. And I think it became clear to us as we're doing the analyses that this idea that facets of psychopathology reflect the exact same level of specificity or generality, in my mind, undoubtedly is wrong. You know, some things are more general, some things are more specific, more narrow band, less narrow band, that sort of thing. So because of that structure we were noticing in the data, we developed subscales in some specific situations. There aren't a ton of subscales, but there are some, and in my view, they're needed in certain very specific situations that I'll show you in a moment. So there were 2 reasons to build subscales. Sometimes they were empirical, meaning when we would do factoring within the items on a given scale, and you'd see 2 very clear factors that were meaningful, but they were correlated 0.9 with each other, or 0.85 with each other. So it was clear that you had 2 very highly intercorrelated, but empirical differentiations of scales. And and there was interest in the review process in not losing those differentiations, you know, because some people, not only in the research world, but perhaps in the clinical world, we're used to seeing a certain construct. And if we had just collapsed them, we'd lose that level of specificity that some might like to see. Similar to that rationale, there are rational subscales. And we're going to be in my goal with these rational subscales is to be 100% intellectually honest about it. And this is when conceptual or practical considerations warranted subscales so that important content was not lost. And the examples I give here are 2 of the key ones that we had to deal with. Things like depressed mood and anxious worry, if you adopt, and those of you who've done these kinds of analyses before, when you subject them to the kinds of structural analyses that I've been describing, those scales tend to go away as independent scales because they correlate so highly with everything. They're non-specific. And yet, so when they didn't appear in the HiTOP-SR that was distributed about 6 months ago to the work groups, to the analytic teams, there was concern. Where's depressed mood? How can you have a psychopathology measure without depressed mood, you know? And there's a bit of a tail wagging the dog on that because this is supposed to be an empirical model. So at least my and some of the analysts way of resolving this was to add some of that content back into the HiTOP-SR experimental version and see how those items do in the context of this final set of items that we've been playing with. And I'll show you how that shook out in a moment. But in some cases, you still can't find empirical differentiations to get a depressed mood and anxious worry to differentiate from each other. Psychometrically, from the level of self-report data collection, they're the same thing. But from the level of face validity, in terms of people in the real world wanting to have a measure that measures the full breadth of psychopathology, there was some desire to maintain that content. And so you'll see how that shakes out. So here are the scales and subscales. I've organized them rationally, and I've highlighted that here with respect to the HiTOP model. I say rationally because I didn't believe before, and I don't believe now that I've seen some of the structural analyses that are coming out. I don't believe that the scales were organized as neatly as this. But I'm showing them rationally this way just to kind of chunk it for our consumption. So this is where we started. I'm going to essentially show you the scales from left to right on this diagram. So I'm going to start with somatoform and kind of work my way across over to externalizing. Okay. The measure, the HiTOP-SR includes these scales reflecting somatoform sorts of issues. And I'm not going to go through and define each of these. Hopefully the names adequately reflect in most cases what the scale represents. Obviously the documentation for the scales will include much more information down the line. But we have a health anxiety, somatic preoccupation, conversion symptoms, disease conviction, and something called bodily distress. Okay. I've also presented not only the number of items, but also the alpha coefficients for each of these. For those of you like omega, omegas have been difficult to calculate for some of these very short scales, and we'll continue to try to find ways to do that. But right now we're using alpha as our internal consistency estimate. Internalizing, I'm doing a little out of order here, but internalizing distress scales. Here's what we have on there. We have something called cognitive problems. I'm not convinced it's in the right rational place here. And you see two examples where we had to create subscales. And maybe I'll focus on those first, because they kind of highlight some of the issues I was talking about a couple slides ago. So if you can put anhedonia, anxious worry, depressed mood, lassitude, and shame and guilt items into a structural analysis, in the way that we've done it, they don't differentiate into those scales in a nice, neat, clean way. So this is a case for distress dysphoria, where we've opted to have a broad distress dysphoria scale. You can think of this as almost akin to like a Beck depression inventory or like an IDAS general depression, if you will, that's comprised of 5 subscales that are rational. They're just based on content. So they hang together within scale. So like if I run the 3 anhedonia items, they'll have a nice alpha. You can see it's an 88 alpha. So they hang together within, but when you try to run them all in the same analysis, you don't get clean differentiation. So you have anhedonia, anxious worry, depressed mood, lassitude, shame and guilt, all together form an overall distress dysphoria scale. You could score it either at the subscale level or at the distress dysphoria level. It's up to you. Same thing with emotionality, and I'm not convinced that's the right label for it, but that's the best we could come up with, where you have affective lability, angry hostility, and irritability, that when you run them together, those items want to intercorrelate more highly than you might like, and they don't differentiate at the scale level. They each hang together quite well as an independent scale, but they're better scored as a single emotionality scale. So the content's there if you want it, or you can just score the emotionality content. There's a couple scales related to insomnia and nightmares, and then there's some non-suicidal self-injury and a suicidality scale. Okay. Internalizing fear. You can see a range of scales here reflecting fear, but also some obsessive compulsive content that I'm not convinced is best located here. That's my own personal opinion, but you see some obsessive compulsive sorts of content, spectrum sorts of content, but then you also see standard fear like agoraphobia and panic, that sort of thing. The one thing that's of note on this slide is that there was a desire in the early subgroups and in the analyses to measure all sorts of different kinds of phobias. And so I don't think of the specific phobia scale as a scale. In fact, I've called it an index because I don't have any belief that all these different phobias really ought to hang together as a scale. It's really just an index of how many fears people are endorsing. That said, I kind of rationally group them into three groupings. There's animal insect sorts of items, blood injection sorts of items, and situational sorts of items. Factor analytically, they'll tend to differentiate mostly that way. But we opted to, instead of having three scales, we just have a single phobia index. And then if you want, you can score those subtypes of phobia separately. All right. There's eating pathology scales because the model specifies eating pathology is one of the sub-factors within internalizing. And you can see we have a broad range of eating pathology scales reflective of that content. Similarly, the model specifies sexual problems. And so we have a range of scales reflecting sexual problems that mostly have reasonable alphas. Okay. If you recall from the model, there's one scale or one sub-factor that's meant to span internalizing and thought disorder, and that's mania. And lots of different kinds of items were written by multiple subgroups related to mania. They all essentially coalesce into these 7 items that we're calling manic energy. Okay. Detachment, there are 6 scales here, ranging from restricted affect, romantic disinterest. There's 2 social withdrawal scales, one focusing on aloofness, one focusing on more fear and anxiety in those contexts. Submissiveness and well-being is kind of a reverse coded detachment scale. Thought disorder scales, here's where you see some more subscales. We have dissociation, eccentricity, fantasy proneness, 2 versions of mistrust that these actually do empirically differentiate, but they're relevant to the same broader idea of mistrust. So we've kept them as subscales. They're highly intercorrelated. And then reality distortion, we broke into 2 subscales as well. And we were able to get this to work empirically as well. But delusions and hallucinations are correlated so highly, 0.85, 0.9 in these data, that we framed it more as as a subscale sort of arrangement. Let's talk about externalizing. These are the antagonism scales. Here, dishonesty breaks into deceitfulness and manipulativeness. Those do break apart empirically, but they're highly intercorrelated. So they're subscales rather than separate independent scales. Disinhibition scales. These get at a range of impulsive content, so non-persistence, non-planfulness, risk-taking are different variations on different themes of impulsivity, if you're familiar with that impulsivity literature. And then there's some scales that get it more like impulsive behaviors, like problematic shopping or gaming or gambling. And then this is not in the HiTOP model, so this is where I've taken some liberties. In the HiTOP model, these would probably be reverse coded disinhibition scales, but I'm framing them as Anacostia scales within, and calling them externalizing doesn't sit 100% well with me, but this is where they were developed, and so that's where I'm putting them for now rationally. But things related to hyperdeliberation, perfectionism, rigidity, risk aversion, and workaholism. Now here's the harmful substance use scales that we're going to have. These are going to be the scales, but the number of items and the alphas for each are what I'm working on right now, because we're honing, we added some new experimental items. So we're going to have essentially 6 primary harmful substance use scales: craving, hazardous use, impaired control, role interference, tolerance, and withdrawal. And now the devil's in the details here, because depending on the substance, the items change on some of these. And this module got very, very complicated every time I had more experts look at it. And so that's why it's taken a little longer to get this thing across the finish line. It's not a scale, but there are some items built into this module that get at frequency of use. And I think that's a nice compromise. There are some people who felt strongly that frequency is not psychopathology. And I tended to agree with that, but nonetheless, the frequency helps whether people can get rooted in or out of this module. So you need to get the frequency information in order to do the module. And so hopefully within the next month, these scales will be finalized as well. And then there's certain scales that the subfactor for antisocial, there are two scales, one reflecting antisocial behavior, which is really just a range of kind of delinquent acts, if you will, and then more general oppositionality. Maybe some of you are kind of keeping score at home. The scales are generally quite short. They average about 5.3 items per scale. The longer ones off to the right there are those composite scales that have a lot of subscales. So there's an 11, a 12, and a 16 item scale, but the bulk of the scales are right around, the mode is 5 items. So these are short, tight scales. In some cases, the alphas are a little lower because of that, but we want a measure that's usable. And so I was a little draconian in some of the final cuts to get us down to a point where the measure is at least within the realm of usefulness, Alphas, you got some of you who are keeping track of the alphas as you go. Largely good. About 85% of the alpha, 83% of the alphas were above 80. So here's the 80 threshold, the magical 80 threshold that some people look at. The mean alpha is 83. And I think 84% of them are above 0.80. Most of the smaller alphas are for scales that are subscales, but not always. Sometimes they're primary scales, and those are situations for future development, frankly, where we, even after building experimental items, we didn't have enough good ones to get the alpha above that line that we were looking at there. There's nothing magical about 0.80, but it's a nice kind of useful heuristic that many of us use. Okay, so what's the structure of these scales? So some of you who are structural folks want to know, what's the structure and does it map onto HiTOP? That's a really important question. So Christian Marcon's been taking the lead on structural analyses. He's particularly well equipped for that kind of analysis, and so it's been nice to have him take the lead on them. But in short, I'm going to give you the summary of what he's found so far. And maybe Christian, if there's questions about that in the Q&A, Christian can pipe in with some of his insights as well. The short answer is it's messy and a work in progress. And when you factor analyze 87 unique bits of information, it doesn't come out as cleanly as you like sometimes. And so why is it messy? Well, here are my ideas for why it's messy. Lots of scales. We have 87 scales. We also have subscales nested within the scales, which adds some complication as to how you analyze the data. There's lots of interstitiality. What I mean by that is that there are certain constructs that are naturally going to cross-load multiple broader factors. Also, I think one thing that's been coming up very clearly is lack of ideal sampling. So in some of the cases, in that some of our lower base rate phenomena, things like the hallucinations and delusions, frankly, conversion symptoms fall into this category. Some of the suicidality content, they all want to load onto the same factor regardless of content, and there's not a lot of conceptual sense for that. It's resulting in a moderately large heterogeneous difficulty factor that lacks the clear substantive meaning. And Christian's been working hard to try to think of ways creatively to cleave that into more interesting subbits, but I'm not convinced we're there yet. And it may be that we just need different kinds of samples to get at some of that content at the scale level. And then the composite sample, that first sample of over 4,000 people, there's lots of missingness in that sample, which makes it difficult to score the scales. Because if it was missing at the item level, not at the scale level. And so what that means is when you go to score a scale, everybody has missing items on almost every scale. And so you have to create some complexity in terms of how you score that. Nonetheless, we'll do that, but it creates some mess to clean up. In the prolific sample, there is no planned missingness, but we're still seeing the first 3 problems I listed there. Okay. So we're iterating. Christian's working hard. He's been sharing things with Roman and me. And as you're going to find out in a moment, I think we're open to having other folks involved in the structural work that we're doing in terms of being on like a subcommittee for that, or what we call a work group for structural work. But Christian's been taking the lead and has been doing a great job. So the question of, I can say pretty confidently that the structure of these scales will not be cleanly the HiTOP model. But looking at some of the work that Christian's presented to me so far and to Roman, I think you see the HiTOP model there, but some things might be missing because they're loading onto that difficulty factor in particular, but the model's there. It's just not going to be as clean as it's shown in the 2017 paper. So other things we're doing or that we're going to be doing, this is kind of the point of transition of a little bit in the talk. We're going to be finishing the harmful substance use module soon. I think we need a work group to start working on potential item and scale level biases as a function of things like ethnicity, gender, other important demographics. Roman's been leading a group to build an interview focused on these constructs. I think there were at least plans in place to build an informant version of the measure that I think can really move forward now that there's a final HiTOP-SR. There already are language translations underway. I think there are 5 or 6. Camilo Ruggiero's leading the language translations work group within measurement. And I think we have 5 underway. And I just got an email late last night for someone who wants to build one that I'll forward to Camilo later today. We obviously need to do a lot of external validation. Almost all the work we've done so far has been internal to the item pool. And so we need now that we have a complete item set and a set of scales, we need to start looking at external validation against other scales or other important criteria that are relevant to this domain. That's really all of this stuff is really phase 3 stuff. If you remember that diagram from early on in the presentation, we need good representative norms. I think the prolific sample we just collected can be an interim set of norms, but it's not ready for, I think, to be a final set of norms. We want to collect a community representative sample that's not done via crowdsourcing. Other things. Short forms and modularization. Obviously, you can think of short forms in 2 different ways. One is it'd be nice to have a version of the measure that just measures the spectra. Like for those who just want to know the broad levels of the model. And from this item pool, I think we can do that. But then you can also think about short forms in terms of modularization. This could be built in a computerized way where people could select which scales they want to use for their research study or their clinical setting, like which scales are relevant for their purposes. As you all were going through it, you probably thought to yourself, well, that seems kind of narrowband. I don't know if I need to know about excoriation in my sample. Okay, for example. Well, you could select to not administer that scale if you want to save those 3 items. I think that's the idea with modularization. And so that work's underway, and we need a group of folks to help do that. We're also going to be building standardized Qualtrics and REDCap modules that can be shared with researchers who wish to use this. And so like for the standard scales, it's not that complicated. It's the same response format. It's a list of 405 items. It's pretty straightforward. But the modularization makes it a little tricky. But the substance use module, I will say, if I just hand you the items and tell you all the branching logic, you're going to make mistakes in putting that together. So we're going to build standardized modules for those of you who use Qualtrics and REDCap, so you can just plug that right into your studies. You don't have to rebuild that, rebuild the wheel, so to speak. And that way, the standardization will reduce errors, I think, especially for the harmful substance use items, because that's just it's a complicated module the way it's structured right now. I think we need to think about how we measure, or if we want to measure impairment independent of these constructs, and that we haven't done a lot of work on that yet. I think there's been interest in downward extending this into adolescents. I think we need to do that for the whole model, frankly, but we also might need measures that can be downward extended. I think if we're going to use this in clinical settings in particular, but frankly also in research settings, we need some way of assessing response validity. And I think clinically, there are some people who might wish to look at things like critical items, like a way to flag certain kinds of content that a clinician would want to know about. It's akin to like what you see with other omnibus measures like the MMPI, for example. Like if they endorse something related to suicidality, a little alarm goes off on the score report so that people can see that content was endorsed. And if we want this measure to be useful clinically, and I have to say I personally do want it to be useful clinically, we need to include a lot of these sorts of things that aren't there right now. And then we need to work on dissemination. Obviously the clinical translation work group's done a great job getting the HiTOP DAT, essentially those HiTOP consistent measures, they're getting those used by clinics around the country, around the world, frankly. But we need to do the same sort of thing with the HiTOP-SR. So some conclusions for the HiTOP-SR. We have a research-ready base HiTOP-SR to go. I can send you an email with it today, but it's going to be on a website soon. And I'm going to post these slides, and I'm also going to post this presentation for those who want to see it in the future, for those who couldn't make it. That module for substance use is going to be completed soon, also will be posted. The clinic-ready version is going to follow later. I don't think we have enough data or information on the measure to say that we can confidently say, yes, go use this with your clients right now. I just don't think we have good norms yet. And I think we'd want to collect more validation data before we set it loose in the clinics. But I think if there's more of a training clinic, maybe it's a good place to start with a measure like this. But I don't think this is something you'd want to send out to private practitioners out there and say, go use it, not yet. I'm going to be spending a lot of time in the next year writing up all these results I just talked to you about, into one or more publications, along with the other members of the team who've been helpful. So publications need to come out. We also need, related to that, I need to work with the clinical translation work group to maybe there's a manual for the HiTOP-DAT, and hopefully we can build this into the HiTOP.DAT manual for, interpretation guidelines could be based on some of these scales as well. These measures are free, they're open source, they're going to be available online. Once I have them clean enough, I'm going to just put them on an open science framework so people can just share them, download them, and you can analyze them all day long and figure out all the wrong decisions I made. You can do all that. It's all going to be open to see, for good or for bad. I'm hoping that the measures will be useful in promoting the HiTOP model in terms, especially the clinical research utility of the model. So the last part I want to talk about, and I'll leave time for discussion here, is reimagining the measures development work group. The measures development work group was really organized around those subgroups for a long time. It's large. There's over 60 members on the list. Many members have been relatively inactive in the past couple of years as the work has been focusing on more smaller groups of analysts to help get the measure to its current state. But we need to reimagine the way it's structured. And so I'm conducting, and I'm going to launch it today. It's already launched, and you're going to see the URL in a moment, and I'm going to send it out via email to folks who weren't able to make the call. An opt-in survey. We're going to kind of start with 0 at the level of the measurement work group. We're going to say that everyone's out of it, and now you're going to opt back in if you want to be part of what we're doing. Because there's just a lot of people who I keep sending emails to. I'm not sure if they even want the emails. I'm not sure what role they want to have. So the purpose of the opt-in survey is to gauge interest in either joining or remaining in the work group. And secondly, to collect information to better assign members to new work groups focused on new projects that need to get done. Some of the things I was talking about before, all the things that have to happen in phase 3. Okay. I'm also soliciting names. I've been really happy to be the chair of this work group, and I want to continue to be part of that process. But I think the work group would benefit from having a second person involved with being the chair of the work group. So if you or somebody you think would make for a good co-chair of the work group, there'll be a way in that survey to kind of designate your interest in doing that. And we'll collect all the names and then figure out a way for selecting the best person. There also is going to be opportunities for folks to lead the various new work groups that are needed. The model of me leading everything is not sustainable. At least it's not sustainable for me. So I need other people who are willing to take leadership roles on some of those projects that we talked about on previous slides here. And the survey will let me collect all the information to figure out how to arrange people within the work group. So here's the opt-in survey. The link is there. I'm going to send it out via email later today. If you have the fancy camera, you can take a picture of the QR code. Again, if you want to stay in the work group or join it, make sure you visit this survey in the next few weeks. You can specify the projects you want to be involved in. There also is going to be, this has been a topic of the level of the broader HiTOP consortium. I think you can also be part of this group of individuals, but not be an active researcher. So you could have just an interest in measurement related issues and want to be included on the emails, if you will, or if we have special meetings at the conferences and whatnot. So I think you can kind of be an interest group member of the group, meaning that you wouldn't necessarily be working on a project, but you want the emails. You don't care about me flooding your email with stuff. There'll be ways to designate that on the survey as well. And again, I said leadership opportunities are available. So final thoughts for those like, I see I've maintained 76 of you so far. That's pretty good. All right, so final thoughts. So you guys get my silly little quote here from a song I like from 30 some years ago. And if you send me an email with the right song title, then I'll get buy you a beer next time I see you at a conference. But this quote is, "Hey man of science with your perfect rules of measure, can you improve this place with the data that you gather?" This quote, I use this quote in my classes sometimes, and it's a quote that resonates to me every time I hear this particular song, because it kind of in the context of the song, for those of you who know the song, it really encourages us to think about the limitations. It's almost sarcastic in a way, the limitations of what we can really do. And so perfect rules of measure, and that segues into my next slide perfectly well. This is not a perfect measure. And I don't think it will ever be a perfect measure. I don't think, and as I say here, all measures essentially are wrong, especially psychological measures. Some are more useful. I hope this is more useful than wrong. That's what I say here. Okay. This measure is a good starting point for helping measure the things that are articulated within the HiTOP model. It is wrong. It will continue to be wrong. And we can make it less wrong over time if those of you who are interested in this want to help me continue on this process. But I think I hope it has the potential to be quite useful, I hope. So we've done a lot. There's a lot more to do. Complete that survey if you have an interest in helping with any of those initiatives that we have planned. And I think that's all I have. These are all the same people I listed on a previous slide who've helped out with various aspects of the project. I should acknowledge that some of the data we collected it was helpful. We had some funding from NIMH for a related project where we were using HiTOP as well. And so I have to acknowledge NIMH in helping with that. There's that same QR code if you're interested in it again. And here's our time for Q&A. So I think what I'm going to do, I think I can see you guys over on this screen over here. If you have questions, then raise your hand, and I think you'll rise to the top here, and I'll leave the slides open in case I need to go back to talk about anything. So what questions are there that people might have? Or is it so 100% clear? Ah, okay. Leanna. Leanna raised her hand.
Sorry, I started without unmuting myself.
Oh, okay.
And I'll start my video too, in case anybody wants to see what I look like. This just is a very picky question, but there's some discrepancy between the tabs in that Excel file that you sent out.
Oh, no.
Between the SR items by scale and the descriptors, prolific final, just in like terms of the names of the constructs and stuff.
Okay.
So we don't have to spend time on it now, but at some point it might be useful to get together and let me point those out and get that straightened out.
That'd be great. Thanks, Leanna. I mean, obviously there have been lots of changes over the last couple of months.
Yeah, it's just little stuff, so nothing to sweat, but
I appreciate that. Hopefully nothing major, but I could see that.
Nope, nothing major.
Thanks, Leanna. Antonia?
Yes. When do you anticipate that the REDCap and Qualtrics versions will be available for researchers?
Yeah, I think if I've got some staff that can help me with it over the next month or so. And so I have a feeling that Qualtrics will come first and then REDCap will come second. If there are members on this call who would be, I mean, ultimately everything's a function of labor. So if there are folks who want to help volunteer to help with that translation into REDCap, I'm not personally great with REDCap yet. I have folks on my staff who are, but if there are folks who would want to help with that sort of process, I could help facilitate it. But I think Qualtrics will come first, followed by REDCap. I would like to think within a month we could get Qualtrics at least, you know.
Great, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Other questions? I've either stunned you all or tired you all out. Probably the latter. All right, well, there don't have to be questions. So you all have, oh, let's see, someone's just joining now. Maybe they have a question, but no, okay. There don't have to be questions. And so if that's the case, I'll close up shop on this call. I will post, I'm going to check with Leanna about some of the discrepancies she talked about before I post everything online. But I'll post the slides and I'll post this talk and I'll post the measure itself, at least in Excel sort of form, so you can see the items. I'll post that within the next couple of days. I have a question out to Roman about which website to post it on and how to get that posting done. If I have trouble with that, I'll just post it on my own website and I'll send out a link to everybody so they can access it on my own website for the time being. But I'll get it all sent out very soon. And thanks all for listening. Have a great rest of your day. And I hope you all start using the measure. Thanks. Thanks all.
Lynn, I can stay on for a few minutes if you want.
Oh, that'd be great. Let me just stop sharing. And then let me stop recording.